I guess I would say that I'm somewhat afraid of commitment. I'm not one to make a commitment very quickly. The other day, my boyfriend, we've been together for about a year and a half, asked me, "Hey, Chad, I know the concept of marriage is something that you're working on personally, that you're exploring what marriage is and what it means to you with your therapist every week. But can you see the possibility at some point in the future of you and I getting married? Yes or no?" And I stopped, and I smiled, and the words that came out of my mouth were, "It's in God's hands." It's in God's hands. Thankfully, my boyfriend is an Episcopal priest, so he understood what I was trying to say theologically. But talk about a non-committal answer, it's in God's hands? Believe it or not, I'm actually less afraid of commitment today than I used to be years ago. And much of what I learned about making a commitment, I learned here at Middle Church. In July of 2005, I walked through these sanctuary doors for the first time. I was a vice president in the finance division at Goldman Sachs, and there was a spiritual void in my life. That first Sunday I was here, I experienced what each of us experiences here every Sunday. I was overwhelmed by the welcome, by the acceptance, by the love. I felt held and comforted, and that there was potential for healing and transformation. I was so deeply moved. I was crying throughout most of, if not all, of the worship celebration. I wasn't a person who liked to make a commitment, but yet I felt moved to make a commitment to walk over into the social hall for coffee hour. Although it really wasn't my thing to do, I felt actually supported by all the energy that I had experienced here in this worship space. I felt that it was carrying me forward into a new place. And so I went into the social hall. As Sundays passed, I would come here for worship, and I would venture back into the social hall, and every Sunday I would spend a little bit more time in the social hall, deepening my connections with this community. That was in the summer. By the winter, in December, I volunteered for the first time. I was an usher at our Christmas Eve worship celebration. And then in February of 2006, I made the big commitment and I joined the church. I became a member of Middle Collegiate Church, deepening my connection. At that time, we were raising funds for the wheelchair lift outside of the sanctuary. Do you all remember that? And I was in the process of selling my apartment at the time, and so I made the commitment that when I sold my apartment, I would tithe. I would give 10% of the gain on the sale of my apartment as a donation to the wheelchair lift campaign. And when I sold my apartment, I did exactly that, deepening my commitment to this community. In September of that year, I volunteered again, and I decided to help lead worship at our Wednesday evening soul care worship. Some of you remember that space. And here in this sanctuary, I preached for the first time, deepening my connection. And here in this sanctuary, I discovered a call to ministry. And so I applied to seminary. And in the spring of the following year, I volunteered to be a member of our mission trip to New Orleans, and we went. And in the fall of that year, I began seminary. I am no longer the same person I was 9 years ago when I first walked through these doors. And much of the transformation that I've experienced happened because I made a commitment to this community. here in this community, I began to address my own racism. Here in this community, I became more confident in my relationships. Here in this community, I learned how to live with people who don't look like me or who don't come from the same cultural background as me. And here in this community, I became slightly less afraid of commitment. What I learned about commitment is that there is a connection between commitment and generosity. A connection between generosity and commitment. Because in order to make a commitment, you have to be generous of heart. To make a commitment, you have to open your heart to be vulnerable. You have to open your heart to be honest with yourself and with others. You have to open your heart to the new and unexpected that await you. In order to make a commitment, you have to be generous with your heart. And at the same time, when you are generous, when you make a donation, you are making a commitment. Whether you want to name it that or not, you are making a commitment. And so what I learned was that commitment requires generosity, and generosity requires commitment. There is a strong connection between commitment and generosity that is shown in our scripture reading today that Jocelyn read for us. This is a parable from Matthew's gospel. It's the story of a slave who has an outstanding debt with the king on the order of 10,000 talents. Now, many thanks to my colleague Jim Casquette, who helped calculate a modern-day equivalent of 10,000 talents. You want to take a guess? Anyone? $1 million? $1. This is not Price is Right. $1 is not an acceptable answer. It's more than $1 million. Anybody else?
2 million.
It's more than 2 million. It is actually, yep. It's not a Googleplex, but that's a good guess. It's actually $4 billion. So this servant was in debt to the king for $4 billion. So of course this slave cannot repay this debt. And this slave is about to be sold into slavery with his wife and his children. And so he goes to the king and pleads for mercy. He says, "Be patient with me and I will pay you." And the king is moved with compassion. And he not only releases the slave, but he forgives the slave of his debt, of his entire debt outstanding. Can you imagine what that would be like? To be suddenly freed of $4 billion of debt?
I want to know how a slave owed $4 billion.
We will, Jerry, that's a great question. Jerry was asking, how did a slave end up owing $4 billion? And we'll address that during Adult Ed today, during the sermon talkback. So come on back. Because there is an answer to that, but we're going to continue along here. I imagine that if I just heard that I had been freed of $4 billion worth of debt, I probably would find myself running up to the king, giving a big old hug and saying, "I'll marry you." Because the king has made a commitment to the slave. The king, in his generosity is so overwhelming. It's unimaginable. $4 billion worth of debt. The story continues. And the slave returns to his community where a fellow colleague, a fellow slave, owes him 100 denarii. Any guesses on how much 100 denarii is worth? It's more than $20. It's more than $5, but you're on the right track. It's $10,000. And this slave, who has just been freed of $4 billion of debt, cannot find it in his heart to be generous on the order of $10,000. He imprisons his colleague in order to extract payment. Unfortunately, because the two men live together in a community, and there are ways in which community members hold each other accountable, some members of the community go to the king and report what has happened. This slave, who you just freed of $4 billion of debt, can't forgive a $10,000 debt. And the king is displeased. And the king orders the slave to be sent to be tortured. In this parable, the king is God, and the slave is you and I. Now, as I say this, I want to remind us that this parable is an allegory. And when we read an allegory, we are not to attribute all the actions of the king onto God. This is an allegory. Because, of course, we would never imagine that God would sell an innocent woman and her children into slavery. And, of course, we would never expect that God would imprison and torture a man. The point of the end of the parable is that God is displeased when we are not generous of heart. God is not happy when we are not generous with each other. God has made an extraordinary commitment to each one of us. God has forgiven all of our spiritual debts on such a great magnitude for all of our human flaws, for all of our human imperfections, for all of our wrongdoings, and all the ways in which we need to use the pencil eraser to erase our mistakes. God has forgiven all of that. God has made a gesture of generosity to each one of us that is almost incomprehensible. And God's generosity is a model for how we are to be generous with each other. Not on the order of 10,000 talents. That's God's work. We can't do that. But we as human beings can forgive each other and be generous with each other on the order of 100 denarii. And that is our work. This program year we are at Middle Church, we are exploring what it means to live as a member of God's household, what it means to be a member of the household of God. And so together we're exploring what does it look like to make a commitment to a community? What does it mean to live faithfully in community, to hold each other accountable, to help each other discover how God is working through and in our lives? That's what we're doing this year. As we explore together commitment and as we explore together generosity. We have a prime example, a prime model of what generosity looks like, what it means to be generous to each other, right here in the midst of our community. As we look at the relationship between Middle Church and the collegiate churches of New York. As many of you know, Middle Church is a part of a larger organization called the Collegiate Churches of New York, along with Marble Church and Fort Washington Church and West End Church and Intersections International. We all make up the Collegiate Churches of New York. And if you look at, Middle Church was founded in 1827. If you look at the almost 300-year history of Middle Church, it is almost unimaginable the generosity that the collegiate churches of New York have shown this congregation. It's almost unfathomable. In 1880s, when the building in which Middle Collegiate Church was meeting, we were on 4th Street and Lafayette Place, when that building was being taken down, there were many people who wanted to move the entire congregation uptown because that's where many of the congregants were moving. But there were a few members of the leadership of the collegiate churches of New York who said, no, we still need a church on the Lower East Side because there are all these immigrant families who are entering into our neighborhood, and these families need a place to worship and a place to call home to. And because of the vision of those leaders, they bought this land on which we're sitting right now. And they built this building in which we are worshiping now because they had a vision and they were willing to be generous to this congregation to allow us to do the ministry we do. 100 years later, in the 1980s, many of you have heard this story, this congregation was fewer than 50 people every Sunday. Imagine 50 people in the pews. And many times the choir were more people than the actual congregants. And yet the Collegiate Church Corporation supported this ministry financially. They paid the pastor's salary, they paid for the pastor's apartment, they paid for the musicians, they paid for the upkeep of this building because they believed in the power of God working through this congregation, even in a small congregation, and they were generous with us. We wouldn't be here today if it weren't for their generosity. Today, 30 years later, we are over 800 members. We are worshiping with people around the world, including Brazil and Japan and Sweden. And in just a few weeks, we are going to be re-entering our church house, where there is a brand new elevator. An elevator so that everyone, every space, is accessible to everyone just as they are as they come through the door. The cost of that renovation project is not cheap. The current estimate of the project is $13 million, all of which has been paid by the Collegiate Churches of New York. What an offer of amazing, outstanding generosity, because they believe in supporting our ministries. On top of that, what it costs to run what we do here every year, our operating budget is on the order of about $2.5 million. It costs $2.5 million to do everything we do here. And the Collegiate Church every year funds about 1.6 of that. So on top of this $13 million, they are funding us even more. They have offered us such an enormous gesture of generosity. And what they are asking from us is to be more generous with each other. They're simply asking us to be more generous with each other, knowing that there's no way we could pay back a $13 million debt. I mean, maybe we could, but it would be very challenging for this congregation to raise $13 million, let alone the $2.5 million it takes every year. They're asking us, they're inviting us simply to be more generous with each other. I have a challenge for us. For those of you who aren't tithing, I'd like to encourage you to tithe 1 week's worth of earnings. Some of us in this community do tithe, and actually there are many of us who tithe. And if you are a tither, I invite you to use this challenge as an opportunity to increase the percentage of your offering to maybe 12% or 15%, just for 1 week. For those of you who are not tithing, take how much you earn in 1 week and divide that by 10. And bring that as an offering on homecoming weekend. And see how that material offering will transform you spiritually. Be open to the ways in which that act may transform you spiritually. I remember the first time I tithed, it was when I wrote the check for the wheelchair lift. I had just sold my apartment. It was a beautiful pre-war Junior 4 co-op in Midtown West. And the gain on the sale was $150,000. And so I found myself writing a check payable to Middle Collegiate Church for $15,000. Talk about being afraid of commitment. I was freaked out. And yet I wasn't, because I knew that God was with me in that moment. I knew that God was working through me through this act to transform who I was and how I viewed commitment. And I knew that God was with this community and that we needed a way to make this sanctuary accessible to everyone. I wish I could say that when I handed over the check, suddenly the Dove stained glass window shone down on me and I was transformed. No. But the transformation did happen gradually over time. And gradually over time, I became less afraid of commitment. And gradually over time, I became more aware of the generosity all around me. The spiritual generosity in this community, as you know, is astounding. The ways we go out and feed people in the parks, the ways we send people out to mission trips to New Orleans and Appalachia, the ways we care for people and comfort people in their times of grief, the ways we touch people around the world through our worship, the ways we teach our young children and teach them how to sing and how to be a part of our community. All of this is an abundance of spiritual generosity, and I became more aware of all of that. And finally, I became more deeply grateful for all of the generosity that God shows each and every one of us every single day. And for that, I give thanks to God. Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. Amen.